All right, let's go ahead and get started here. Well, welcome everyone. Before we get started, we have just a few housekeeping and logistic items. I'm your host, Sam Wins, conservation biologist and science educator with the National Park Service right at Cabrillo National Monument. So tonight's talk is in webinar format, which means you will only be able to see the host and the panelists' faces. So don't panic if you don't see your friends, all right? This also means that we have a lovely Q&A function for all your burning questions. Just click on the Q&A button, either at the bottom of your screen or at the top bar of your screen, depending on your computer, to add your question. And questions will be queued up in the order they were received. When James pauses for questions during the chat and at the Q&A at the end, I will read your questions to him to answer. And there are a lot of us here tonight, so please keep your mic muted in order to prevent cross traffic. If you must unmute to ask a question, please wait for the Q&A at the end. And you can type a message in the chat to let me know that you need your mic to be unmuted, all right? You may have noticed that captions are available for tonight's talk. Thank you to Christina, our live captioner, and sponsorship from the Cabrillo National Monument Foundation. Please click on the CC for closed caption at the bottom of your screen, or again, that might be on the top bar of your screen. You can also choose to read a transcript, which we can provide to you at a later time. And speaking of sponsors, Cabrillo National Monument Foundation sponsored this whole event, so big thanks to them. All right, now that the boring housekeeping stuff is over with, let's get to the good stuff. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. James Hung. James is a Canadian ecologist who received his PhD at UC San Diego, where he studied native bee diversity and conservation in San Diego's endangered coastal sage scrub ecosystem. He currently lives in Toronto, Ontario, in Canada, with his wife and 2 small children as he completes his postdoctoral fellowship in pollination biology at the University of Toronto. In his spare time, James enjoys being outdoors with his kids, making food with his wife, and playing the violin in his church band. James's favorite insects are bees, of course, and his favorite non-bee insect is the mole cricket. And James, you know I'm going to be asking you about that later. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. James Hung. Take it away, James.
Right. Thank you so much for having me. Can you confirm that you can actually see the screen that I'm sharing?
Confirm.
Okay, perfect. I am going to, let's see, hide self-view here, and so it doesn't distract me. So thank you again for having me here, and hello everyone. So as Sam introduced, I have been studying bees for quite a while now, and I'm really excited to share with you all some of what I've learned over the last decade or so. And I should also mention before I start that if you see photos that don't have any copyright attributions, they are my own photos. It just feels weird for me to see my name everywhere when I'm giving a presentation. So I've decided to take all of my own self-attributions out. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about myself. I was born in Taiwan, which had a very strict and regimented education system. So as someone who struggled with ADHD, I actually started having issues with schooling starting in pre-kindergarten. And every day I would just get spankies and corner time from my teachers. But thankfully, my mom was able to transfer me out of that class to a different teacher who recognized that I wasn't just like this bad kid who wanted to cause trouble. It's just I had a hard time staying focused inside when everybody else is working. So this teacher sent me out to the schoolyard to observe butterflies and dragonflies and ants, and to report back to her about what they were doing, you know, where their nests are, what flowers they like to visit. And so a miniature entomologist was born, and I spent the rest of my years in Taiwan catching and observing insects whenever I could. And when I moved to Canada at age 10, I continued my studies of insects, even though you know, Canada is not a world biodiversity hotspot like Taiwan is. Here you can see that even on family vacations, I would bring my trusty net with me. I even enlisted my younger brother as my very first field assistant. and enlisted my parents as my very first research sponsors. So this was a Maclay's spectre stick insect that we raised in the basement that my parents let us convert into an insect rearing laboratory. After high school, I went to college in New Hampshire. Again, not terribly exciting for insects, but I was able to continue studying them through a series of biology courses I took that were taught by some of the world's best teachers. And these here are photos from a field course that I took in Costa Rica. And as you just heard, I did a PhD at UC San Diego and then did a postdoc at the Ohio State University to learn about how to best balance pest control with pollinator protection in pumpkin fields. And then currently I'm postdocing at UO Toronto, figuring out how best to measure and boost pollination services in apple orchards. But since COVID has started, mostly I'm just, eking out my quarantine and lockdown time with my little family here. Okay, so now we're done with the introduction. Let's open our discussion on bees with this question. Where do plants come from? That's not a trick question. We know that plants mostly grow from seeds. And in order to produce seeds, plants need to combine genetic material from a father and a mother, just like animals. Now, one feature about plants is that they're rooted in the ground and they can't move. So how do they go about exchanging genetic information with another individual that's far away? Well, they need a system that includes a mobile component. And that mobile component is pollen, which is the male gametophyte of the plant. So this here is an electron micrograph image of pollen of several different plant species at 500 times magnification. And you can see that there are different sizes and shapes that are specific to each plant species. So pollen grains are produced by specialized structures in the plant's flower, and their goal in life is to go to another flower and germinate onto the receptive structure and fertilize the other flower's egg cells, which then develop into seeds. Now, how does pollen get from one plant to another? Well, many plant species are pollinated by the wind, like our familiar lawn grasses and corn and other grains and ragweeds here on the bottom right-hand side. Now, wind-pollinated plants are the cause of hay fever, which is just windborne pollen floating into your face and trying to fertilize your nose and your eyes, and then your body freaks out at this unwanted advance from these plants. Now, dispensing your pollen via the wind can be very inefficient and wasteful. And so wind-pollinated plants have to make a lot of pollen. So this photo here is a layer of some sort of pollen on some poor guy's car window. And as you can see, this guy was not very happy about the pollen covering his car. So you can imagine that if all plants on Earth did this kind of pollination strategy, there would just be so much pollen everywhere all the time. So thankfully, most plant species are not pollinated by the wind. Instead, the majority of the plant species, about 85% is the current estimate, are dependent on animals for pollination to some extent. And so pollination for plants is literally about the birds and the bees, and the flies and the beetles and butterflies and moths. And as many of you would have learned from last month's Naturally Speaking presentation at Cabrillo, bats as well. So what makes them good pollinators? All these organisms that come from very different lineages have a lot of things in common. So first, they all have great mobility. These are all strong flyers, right? So you wouldn't want, let's say, an earthworm or a slug to be your pollinator because they'll lose all the pollen as they trudge along the ground from one plant to another. They all also have very good sensory ability to detect flowers in a landscape, whether that be a keen eyesight or keen sense of smell or a combination of both. And they also have a reliance on the resources provided by flowers for food. So for most of these organisms, it's the sugary, sweet nectar that the flowers produce to attract these pollinators. And some of them also feed on the pollen or on petals or other tissues on the flowers. This last point, where the plants are producing these resources to attract pollinators, really illustrates the fact that pollination, this relationship between plants and animals, is more of a mutual exploitation than a harmonious partnership, because pollinators are always trying to get the most food while putting in the least amount of effort to pollinate the plants, whereas the plants are always trying to pay the least amount of pollen and nectar to hire these animals to pollinate them. But in general, the balance of these two sides tend to work out pretty balanced in this free, unregulated market system. So the tremendous amount of biodiversity that we see in plants and pollinator can be sustained, even though partners are generally speaking acting in a selfish manner. As you can imagine, there can be pretty heavy competition between plant species for the services of pollinators. So plants invest a lot of resources to advertise their flowers. So whereas we humans consider reproductive organs to be private parts, in plants, they're just the opposite, as you can see from these 8 showy plant species from the deserts of San Diego. Even relatively unelaborate flowers from our perspective can actually have some pretty amazing patterns that we can't see, generally with darker pigments in the center that are sensitive to ultraviolet spectrum of light. And these are geared towards pollinators that can see into the ultraviolet spectrum, and these patterns help them to orient to the center of the flowers where all the action occurs. So as you can imagine, different kinds of flowers with their different colors and structures and scents are attractive to different kinds of pollinators. And many dissertations and scientific articles and books have been written about this topic, so I'm not going to explore them in much detail. Instead, as advertised, I'm going to focus just on bees today because they're my favorite, and they're also, generally speaking, considered to be the most important pollinators in our system and in many systems across the world due to their complete reliance on flowers for their entire life cycle. So the first step to learning more about bees is learning how to recognize one. So bees are insects that are often very fuzzy. In fact, taxonomists we categorize an insect as a bee based on, among other things, the fact that this insect has branching hairs somewhere on its body. Bees also have a thin waist, as you may recall from a lot of different kinds of cartoon drawings. Bees have also flattened hind legs on which, for many species, there are long bristly hairs that are used to carry pollen. And I'll cover that in a little bit more detail later. When bees are at rest, they often hold their wings in an overlapping fashion, flat on their backs. Bees also have cylindrical rod-like antennae, and bees have large eyes to help them navigate, but they do not have these huge bugged out eyes like, for example, dragonflies have. Now, since bees are categorized by scientists as vegetarian wasps, they're a specialized member of the Hymenoptera, which includes ants, wasps, and bees. It makes sense that the insect that's most often confused with bees is the wasp. Like bees, wasps have rod-like cylindrical antennae and a thin waist, and often these striking dark and light contrasting patterns on their bodies. But unlike bees, wasps do not have flattened hind legs. The legs tend to be cylindrical instead. And wasps often hold their wings kind of at an angle above their backs, and often the wings are folded like a hot dog bun. In the bee, the wings are never folded in this way. And wasps are also not very hairy. And the last thing is, if you see an insect that looks vaguely bee or wasp-like and it's carrying some sort of prey, that's a dead giveaway that this is not a bee, because bees never hunt other insects. Here's another insect that often gets confused as a bee. This is a hoverfly. Many different species of flies, in fact, many different groups of flies imitate bees and wasps because bees and wasps are known to have painful stingers, so it helps for other insects to imitate them. Flies, as you can see, have these big, bugged out, almost hemispherical eyes. They have shorter, bristly antennae instead of these long, rod-like antennae that bees and wasps have. They also have wimpy, non-flattened legs that usually are not very hairy at all. And they only have a single pair of wings, unlike bees and wasps that have 2 pairs. And when flies are at rest, usually the wings are held in a single plane, not in overlapping fashion across their backs. But you also get a lot of bees out there that don't hold their wings in a manner that's similar to the other bees out there. You also have some bees out there that are a lot less hairy than others. So you should really take this, bee identification or bee recognition 101 that I gave you just now with a grain of salt. You also see, some insects like this particular small hoverfly here that does hold its wings overlapping over its back, like many bees do. If you see an insect out there and you're wondering what it is, take a photo of it. And there are people who will be more than happy to tell you what it is. And I'm going to cover that in a little bit more detail later as well. But at any rate, it takes a lot of time for even trained biologists to learn whether an insect is a bee or not, just because of how highly diverse bees are. Now, speaking of the diversity of bees, San Diego County is actually a global hotspot of bee biodiversity. Let me drink some tea. Of the 20,000 bee species that are currently known in the world, about 700 of them can be found here in the bounds of San Diego County, which means that at just 0.002% of the world's land area, our county has over 3% of the world's bee biodiversity, which is absolutely amazing, I think. It's a number that's higher than what many entire states have in the eastern US, and I think just about every province of Canada. In fact, 700 is also higher than most countries in the world. So why is it that San Diego County has so many bee species? Well, several reasons. We're a county that has a lot of vegetational diversity, so plant diversity. We have a lot of elevational diversity from sea level all the way up to some pretty high mountains. And then we also have some deserts. And with this elevational diversity also comes a lot of climatic diversity. And also San Diego sits at the interchange of a temperate North American biome and a more tropical Central American biome. So organisms from many different lineages, including bees, kind of converge in our area. So here are the faces of 16 bees from San Diego County, from the coast to the desert, to help you to literally put some faces to the statistics that I mentioned just now, and to give you an idea of just like the incredible variation that exists in this group. We'll be spending the next few minutes on a brief overview of how bees live their lives. But before that, I'd like to pause and just talk very briefly about the insect that I'm picturing here, which, as many of you will recognize, is the Western honeybee. This is the insect that most people would think of when they hear the word bee. In fact, a lot of people and media outlets never mention this species as the honeybee or even the Western honeybee. They just say bee and assume that everyone's going to understand that this is the insect they're talking about. This insect, as you know, they live in huge colonies that are centered around a queen who is the only one who lays fertilized eggs. The workers work really, really hard all the time to make lots and lots of honey in their honeycombs, which they defend very aggressively with very painful stings. Right, so all these life history facts about honeybees, I think, are familiar even to elementary school kids. I know because my son had to study this as well in his kindergarten class. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this species because it is not native to North America, but was introduced to our continent as kind of a livestock by some of our first European settlers. Now in San Diego, of course, we see the honeybee everywhere because they've escaped their management by humans and they have established thriving populations all over the place. I will return to this topic a little bit later, but for now I'm going to focus on native bees and give you some potentially shocking stats. So first, most bees, the vast majority of bees don't make honey. More than half of the bees out there are incapable of stinging you. Again, most bee species out there are not social. And about 1 in 8 species of bees do not make an honest living. So hopefully this is a surprise to you. If it is, you're in for a treat as we learn about how these native bees out there make a living. So for the majority of bee species, their life cycle goes like this. A female bee collects pollen and nectar from flowers, and then she deposits them in a nest cell that she excavates underground. Once she has collected enough nectar and pollen, she forms a provision ball and lays an egg on it. And while she's busy doing all of these tasks, the male bees don't really do much other than fly around and chase females. I mean, they only have half the amount of DNA that the female bees have, so I think we can give them a break. Anyways, when the egg hatches, the baby bee here, as you can see, called a larva, gets to live one of the cushiest lives of any baby animal out there. Because you can see it has no external body parts that are needed for survival. And that's because it really doesn't need to do anything. It's born in this dark, comfortable, sealed chamber, safe from the external harsh realities of this world, on top of this giant food pillow that has all the nutrition it needs to grow into a pupa. So bees go through complete metamorphosis, just like our more familiar butterflies do. And this pupa stays quiet underground until the conditions are right the following year, when the adult bees emerge and the life cycle happens again. Okay, so is everyone doing okay so far? Should we pause for some quick Q&A before we move on?
Yeah, that sounds awesome. We do have some great questions here in the Q&A function. So Mark wants to know, he's curious about bee flies. They mimic bees and pollinate, yes? Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on bee flies there, James?
Yeah, so bee flies are true flies in the family Bombyliidae, and they do pollinate, but they're not great pollinators for as many flowers as bees are. I certainly have read studies that found that they can be great pollinators for certain flowers, but some bee flies they can obtain nectar with very, very long proboscises that just barely dip into the flower's nectar wells. And the fly itself, even though as a family they're pretty fuzzy, sometimes the flies don't even make contact with the reproductive structures. But yeah, they are flower visiting insects, and like most flower visiting insects, they do act as pretty good pollinators for at least a subset of the plant species that they come into contact with. Good question.
Definitely a great question. I actually didn't know about bee flies until just recently. Liz would like to know, how many San Diego native bee species are solitary and how many are hive dwellers? You touched on this just a second ago, but maybe you can elaborate.
Yeah, San Diego, I think there are fewer solitary bee species. Sorry, there are fewer social bee species in San Diego than there are in many other places in the world. So the tropics is where there are the most social bee species. And I'm going to touch on this in just a little bit. In San Diego, we really have just two lineages of social bees. One is the sweat bees and one is the bumblebees. I will cover this in a little bit as well. If I had to guess, I would guess that probably, so the global average is about 90% of bees are solitary. In San Diego, I'm probably gonna, spitball at like a 95 to 96% solitary. I could look this up. One of the issues with knowing this number is that there are so many bee species in our county that are unknown, and the unknown diversity, a large part of this unknown diversity exists in a group that is generally speaking social. So so basically how big that pool of unknown species is will determine this ratio between social and solitary. So basically, yeah, sorry to not have a firm answer for you.
Yeah, so basically we're still discovering information about these insects, right? And so
very much so, very much so.
So Christina would like to know, are Apis mellifera considered an invasive species in San Diego?
Ooh, it depends on whom you ask. There are some pretty militant honeybee defenders out there, and there are people who really view honeybees as ecological threats and pests. I would say that by the general definition of an invasive species, the honeybee is absolutely an invasive species in San Diego. And I will touch upon that in a little bit. I'll show you some data from my research about what honeybees are actually doing. So you can look forward to that.
Ooh, yeah, I do look forward to that. And then let's just do one more question, and then we'll hold the rest of the Q&A for a little bit later.
Sure.
Libby would like to know, do all native bees pupate in the way you describe when you're underground?
All native bees do pupate. The actual pupal stage depends on the species. So most native bees do spend a prolonged amount of time, being very, very quiet, basically undergoing a state that's kind of like hibernation or estivation. But what stage they do this in depends on the species. So some spend the most amount of time as kind of the last instar larva, so the stage right before they pupate, and then they pupate and then quickly emerge. Some spend a lot of their time as pupae, whereas others will actually pupate and then emerge from the pupa and then stay quiet as adults. So it depends on the species. And one of my mentors is the world's expert in North American bee kind of larval life. And he spends a lot of his time rearing bees that he excavates from nests and documenting how long each life stage lasts. I have a lot of respect for this kind of work, but I personally haven't really studied what these patterns are, so I can't really give a very firm answer, other than the fact that it does vary across species and lineages, and it likely varies, especially among groups that live in different climatic environments. So, for example, there are species that are known to diapause, so basically go quiet for multiple years in the desert, in places where you could go for several years without the rain. So these life history strategies do differ across species.
And that makes perfect sense when you think about it, right? It would make no sense for these bees to be coming out when there are no flowers in bloom because there have been no rains, right?
Exactly.
These are excellent questions, everybody. Please keep queuing up your questions in the Q&A, and I promise we'll get to more of them later. James, go ahead and continue.
Yeah, great questions, guys. Thank you so much for them. All right, so from here, I'm going to go through a quick kind of slideshow of just a bunch of cute bee photos. So the last thing I left off was the fact that bees, when they sense that the environmental conditions are right, they leave their nest, and their natal nest, that is, and the life cycle kind of repeats from the step one that I introduced. So when is that timing right will depend on what bee species it is. So many of our bee species here in San Diego are pollen specialists, which means that they will only provision their nest with pollen from one plant family, or even one plant genus, or even one plant species. So in such cases, their emergence time will be very closely tied to the blooming time for the plant species. And they really will have cued in to the conditions that will cause that plant species to bloom. So here is a photo of a micro digger bee that only collects pollen from indigo bushes and smoke trees and dyeweeds. So these three are kind of three sisters in the same plant genus. And so this bee can only be found when those plant species are in bloom. And here is a turret bee that only collects pollen from cactus flowers. It's not super choosy with respect to which cactus, but it has to be a cactus for it to collect pollen from it. Why is it called a turret bee? That's because they build little turrets that lead up from their nest entrance, presumably as a defense against bombolea flies. Here it is again, bombolea bee flies that literally hover above their nest entrance and shoot eggs into the burrow. So these are nest parasite flies, and apparently these little turrets can, to some extent, defend these nests from these shooting egg missiles. So there are pollen specialist bees on all kinds of different plant species out there, including pretty uncommon plant species. So you can imagine that pollen specialists on uncommon plant species will be pretty rare themselves, like these Calliopsis bees that only collect pollen from mustang flowers. Ground nesting specialist bees also include some of the tiniest bee species in North America, and indeed in the entire world. So this here is the Euphorb mini fairy bee, a pretty cute name for a pretty cute bee. It specializes on the flowers of sand mat plants. So for those of you who are botanists out there, you know how small sand mat flowers are. So you know how tiny this bee is. For those of you who are not botanists, here's good old Abe Lincoln for scales. You can see that the bee is about 2 to 3 penny letters in length. So truly tiny bee, and you would never know that it existed unless, you know, for some reason you put your face down the sand right next to where the sand mat is growing. So given that specialist bees completely depend on the pollen of their host plants, you would imagine and assume that they would be, you know, these like high quality, super high fidelity pollinators for their host plants, right? Actually, that's not always the case. So here is an example where that's not necessarily the case. So this is a currant miner bee. So as this name implies, it's a specialist on currants. And this particular species really likes to visit the flowers of fuchsia flowering currant, which if you know a little bit about the biology of this plant species, it's got these long tubular flowers that are primarily hummingbird pollinated. And yet here it is, this bee collecting pollen from it. You can actually see from this photo that it's only touching the pollen giving structures and not touching the pollen receiving structure. So in some cases, specialists are really, really good pollen thieves and not necessarily great pollinators. And again, you know, this illustrates the fact that that plants and pollinators really are out after their own interests and really don't care about what kinds of services they're rendering to their partner. So another assumption people might make about, you know, specialist bees is that they're not really relevant to you know, most people out there because they're associating with such a narrow set of plant species. But actually, some specialists can actually be very economically important if what they associate with happens to be an economically important crop, like this squash bee here that pollinates pumpkins and squashes. So I did a postdoc studying pumpkins and read a bunch of literature. And in places where squash bees are common, they can pollinate the entire pumpkin field before the honeybees even wake up and leave their hives. So if you properly take care of your squash bee population, you don't even need to go out and hire alternative pollinators to pollinate your pumpkin and squash fields. All right, so for the sake of covering all the major groups of bees in our region, in the bounds of this talk, I'm going to show you just one more ground nesting specialist bee. This is Fuchs evening bee, which is a specialist on sun cups in the evening primrose family. All right, so even though I just showed you a bunch of pollen specialist bees just now, and indeed specialists are a large portion of the bee diversity in San Diego, in most desert regions around the world, actually, there's a lot of specialist bees. The majority of bees on Earth are actually pollen generalists, which means that they can forage on and accept pollen from many different kinds of plant species. The most highly generalized bee species, as you may know, is the honeybee. And that's why it's such a popular crop pollinator, because you stick it on a crop and it'll be like, I can live on this, and they'll go and forage. Here in this picture is a pollen generalist. It's a striped sweat bee. You know, for most people, I would say that, you know, this probably looks incredibly exotic with its, you know, bright metallic green coloration, but actually this is one of San Diego's most common native bees. You may have seen them and just not recognize that they're bees. They have a special place in my heart, striped sweat bees do, because a couple years ago, the city of Toronto actually officially named one of the striped sweat bee species as the official bee of the city of Toronto. And that's because they live in condos, just like most Torontonians do. I currently live in a tiny condo apartment. So what this means is that you know, several females, sometimes a couple dozen, they'll share a nest entrance and they'll build their own subdivisions leading from that central nest shaft and kind of do their own thing, you know, build their own nest cells and stuff. But then they take turns serving as concierges to guard the nest tunnel. While others are working and foraging. So I guess the city thought that this bee is a, you know, it's a hardworking bee, it's a beautiful bee, and it's a very tolerant, sharing bee that, you know, volunteers its time to for the good of its neighbors. So they're like this bee really encompasses the spirit of Toronto. So let's make this our official city bee. So as far as I know, San Diego doesn't have an official city bee yet. So let's, maybe we can think about one. Here's the second ground nesting generalist bee I'm showing you. It's a polyester bee or a cellophane bee. The name comes from the fact that it lines its nest with a waterproof secretion that is chemically and physically very similar to cellophane. So it's waterproof. And instead of depositing a pollen ball, it uses this kind of waterproof bag to contain a soupy pollen nectar slurry. One really cool thing about polyester bees and their relatives is that this soupy pollen nectar slurry will tend to ferment and start to bubble and develop a yeasty smell. And early biologists who have excavated these nests noticed this and wrote those down in their notes. And this observation inspired scientists to hypothesize and then ultimately demonstrate that bees, not just the cellophane bee, or polyester bee, but all bees that have been studied, they actually derive a lot of their nutrients from microbes that colonize their pollen nectar provisions. So that means bees, these bee provisions that the mother bee makes, they're actually not just pollen nectar, they're kind of this value-added product like kombucha or yogurt or something that's got a high microbial biomass. And it makes bees some of the earliest brewers. It puts them a little bit closer to microbe eaters than just strict vegetarians. So, so moving on, among the bees that don't excavate nests underground, most of them nest in wood. So some bees, like carpenter bees, can carve their own tunnels into wood, but most wood tunnel nesting bees use pre-existing cavities left behind by beetles and other critters, or in the case of this picture I'm showing you here, human researchers. Since these bees don't construct their own homes, but rather they're renting pre-existing spaces, they have to bring in their own furniture to make the place comfy and hospitable. So some species cut leaves and petals to surround and protect their pollen balls and their babies. There are others that will scrape wool and hair, trichomes basically, from plants and kind of weave them together into almost like a cloth or fabric bag. Some others will use mud or resin. So even though these bees are not laboring and excavating lots of dirt to make their tunnels, they do have to spend a considerable amount of their time and energy scrounging around for nest building materials. So here's one of the wood tunnel nesting bees. It's a leafcutter bee. It belongs in the family Megachilidae, whose members collect pollen using pollen brushes not on their hind legs, but on the underside of their abdomen. As you can see, it's got kind of this reverse cape full of pollen. So I like to say that in the world of the bees, it's the ladies that have hairier legs or hairier bellies. Here's another wood tunnel renter. It's a masked bee, which is the other member of the polyester bee family that occurs here in San Diego. If you look at this picture, you can tell that it's not very hairy. It doesn't have a pollen brush anywhere on its body. It looks very wasp-like, for most people, including for me. And that's because unique among all bees, it actually transports pollen by swallowing it. And then it regurgitates the pollen when it gets back to the nest, which has made this bee incredibly difficult to study because for most bees that do collect pollen, they carry them on their hind legs or under their abdomen. So you can go up to a bee when it's in a flower and see if it's stuffing pollen under its abdomen or stuffing pollen into its legs. Whereas for this one, it's just kind of mucking around the flower. You don't know when it's eating pollen. You don't know if its tongue sticking out is lapping up nectar. So in order to study the dietary preferences of this bee, you actually have to go break into their nest cell and take out the pollen and sequence it or stain it or collect bees that are returning from their foraging and take the pollen out from their crop and do some sequencing. And actually, I have a senior colleague who did such a study, and it was quite a challenge to do. So as I mentioned earlier, some bees can drill their own holes in wood, like this large carpenter bee here. When I say large, it is quite large. It's about the size of a large grape, or about the last joint of my thumb. I have pretty chubby thumbs. So because of this habit of drilling holes through solid wood, these large carpenter bees can actually become a pest for humans when they make their homes in our outdoor wooden structures. And this ability to excavate wood actually also makes them pests to some plants as well, not in the way you would think. because their jaws are so strong and can bite through wood, they can also use these strong jaws to chew holes in long tubular flowers that are supposed to be pollinated by birds or by butterflies and moths that have long tongues. And in so doing, they're robbing the nectar that they really should not have legitimate access to. So this again is demonstrating the utilitarian and selfish nature of the relationship between plants and pollinators. Just for fun, I'm showing you a carpenter bee nest that shows the cushy lives of the bee larvae. Basically, they just have their own private rooms. They just eat their food pillows. You can tell from this photo that the nests are constructed chronologically from the left to the right. And you can see that there are divisions between them, which is actually sawdust from the excavation effort that the bee then glues together using some secretions. So actually, here's another take-home fact for the day, is that carpenter bees are the inventors of the particle board. Okay, so here's a close relative of the large carpenter bee, aptly named the small carpenter bee, which is, these are much smaller bees compared to large carpenters. And unlike their, much stronger cousins who can bore through solid wood, these aren't quite as strong, but they do still excavate their own tunnels inside small stems. All right, on to our next fact. More than half of the bees out there can't sting. One reason is that there's a bee tribe called the Melanoponini, where 500 or so species that all live in the tropics, they all have no stingers. When I mentioned that stat about social bees earlier, at 500 species, this group is a major component of the social bee fauna around the world. And since they only live in the tropics, they're not here in California, except in the Bay Area. There's a small population that's descended from a population sent by some Brazilian researchers to a Stanford professor. And then that population, I guess, escaped from cultivation. And now, I think like 30 years later, that you can still see remnants of this population. And there's some efforts to track how far that species could be spreading. These bees that I photographed here were from their actual native habitat in Costa Rica when I vacationed there. Now, the more important reason why most bees out there can't sting is that about half the bees out there are males. And since stingers are actually modified egg-laying organs and male bees don't lay eggs, all the male bees out there can't sting. But I should also mention at this point that even female bees that are able to sting, they will not sting unless you actively harass them and like try to grab them in between your hands. Even if you like kind of swat at them, they would much rather just fly away and go somewhere else to do their pollen and nectar collecting than get into tussles with large bipedal hairless monsters like us. Okay, so the next fact I mentioned is that solitary living is the norm among bees. But still, 1 in 10 species do live social lives where there's a queen that lays eggs and workers that forage for resources and maintain the nest. So bumblebees are probably the most familiar social bees to everyone. In fact, probably next to the honeybee, the bumblebee is the most familiar bee in general. So here you can see in this photo of a nest that bumblebees do also build little wax containers to contain the nectar that they collect. But unlike honeybees, it's a much more messy affair. Basically, the standardization is not there, right? As you can see as well, the workers are all sorts of different sizes, as are the honey pots that they build to store their resources. Another difference between bumblebees and honeybees is that bumblebee colonies are much smaller. They usually have just a few dozen to a few hundred individuals, unlike honeybee colonies where a strong colony can be tens of thousands of workers at a given time. And unlike honeybee colonies where the queen lives for several years, the bumblebee colony is annual. It means that at the end of the season, only the newborn queens will survive and go and hibernate through the winter, and then they have to build everything from scratch the following year. So whereas a honeybee queen literally can't collect her own resources because she doesn't have the wiring or the morphology for that, the bumblebee queen is actually a pretty reasonably good pollen connector and nest builder. Besides bumblebees, our only truly social native bees are all sweat bees. So like this tiny metallic sweat bee, that's true to its name, licking sweat from my finger. You can see the little bee proboscis sopping up microscopic drops of sweat. I wasn't particularly sweaty that day, so I don't know how much this bee was able to get from my index finger. Our other common bright metallic green bee, the peridot bee, is also a social species, but we know a lot less about the social lives of these guys, so there's a lot more for us to study. Okay, next fact. What's this fact about not working hard and earning an honest living all about? Like, how does a bee provide for her babies if they don't work hard to make a nest and collect pollen and nectar? Well, the answer is they can invade the nest of a different bee species and deposit their own egg there on or near the pollen provision. And then when their babies hatch, the baby can eat the host's egg or the host's young larva and then take over the pollen ball for itself. So this lifestyle is called kleptoparasitism. And if this lifestyle sounds like a familiar story that you've heard somewhere, it's probably because you have heard this story in cuckoo birds. So it wouldn't surprise you to hear that kleptoparasitic bees are generally commonly known as cuckoo bees. So here in the picture is a squash longhorn cuckoo bee, which exclusively parasitizes squash bees. And sometimes they can be found in large numbers near a pumpkin patch. So this is where I took that picture. It's next to a pumpkin patch I was working on in Columbus. But this same species does also occur in San Diego. Cuckoo bees come from a number of different lineages across 3 different bee families. So it's a lifestyle that has arisen time and time again among bees. And parasites really are a pretty diverse component of the bee fauna here in San Diego. Roughly 1 in 8 bee species in the world, as I mentioned, are cuckoo bees. Despite their varied backgrounds, though, I feel like they all kind of look evil and waspy. I mean, doesn't this cuckoo bee just look like it's plotting something? It's just like up to no good, like yeah. Okay, here's another cuckoo bee. It's a tiny Oreopisides. If you're familiar with Cryptantha, that's the flower it's on. It's a very small bee, which this bee currently still lacks a common name, although my colleagues are working hard to give common names to all the bees out there so that not only hardcore biologists can know who they are, but the lay public and policymakers can also come to know the bees by more than just their Latin scribble, basically. So here you can see that indeed, as a kleptoparasite, she does not have any pollen collecting hairs because she doesn't need to do any of that. So one might think that this nomadic marauding lifestyle is, carefree and easy living, irresponsible, but carefree and easy. But you'd be wrong because this lifestyle really limits you to only being able to exist where your host bees are abundant. And many, in fact, most of these cuckoo bees are very, very specific with respect to what host bee it can parasitize. And it's really the exception rather than the norm for a cuckoo bee species to be able to utilize multiple hosts. So it really does kind of put a limit on how common you can get. And also, it's only a matter of time before you bump into the host bee and get roughed up, like this morning bee here, that's being forcefully escorted off the premises by its digger bee host. Busted. So such violent encounters may also explain why this particular morning bee I saw in the desert, I don't know if you also, like me, saw this photo and be like, there's something odd about this bee. If you can't quite put your finger on it, it's because she's missing both of her antennae. And I think the likeliest explanation is that, she entered some digger bee's nest, got into a tussle and lost her antennae. So there's probably real risks involved with this kind of behavior. So I'm going to conclude this segment of the talk about bee diversity because it'll take all day to go through all the major bee groupings and tell you all the cool things that are particular to each bee group and how they live and how their various weird structures relate to particular functions. So hopefully this has been just a nice sneak preview for you all, and you'll get the opportunity to go and enjoy seeing these native bees in the wild doing their own thing. In fact, the best bee season, best season for observing bees is basically right now at Cabrillo and coastal San Diego. So I really hope you'll take this opportunity. This will persist into about June or so. And then after that, bee diversity will start to decline as the diversity of plants that are in bloom also starts to decline. But right around that point, that's when our mountains and deserts are reaching very high diversity in certain areas. So when you're done with the coast, head inland up to the mountains and the deserts. Basically anywhere in the natural environment where you have large expanses of natural habitat and lots of plants in bloom, you should be able to see lots of beautiful bees doing their thing. Okay, so before we move on to the next topic, let's take another question break.
All right.
And tea break for me.
Yeah, so we only have about 10 minutes left. So let's just answer a couple of questions because I want to make sure you get to how we can help conserve these amazing beautiful bees.
Sure.
So I'm going to go for, let's see, what native bee in San Diego County is considered to be the rarest? Do you happen to know this one, James?
I do. It is a bee in the cuckoo bee genus Hocoposides, and there's a single individual known, and I was the collector. So this single individual, which could very well be the only known individual in the world, is currently sitting in a cabinet in Columbus, waiting for the right taxonomist to come along to describe it.
Oh my gosh. I hope it's not the only single individual in the world.
I hope not as well. But if it were, then at least now we have a specimen to know it by, and we have a cautionary tale.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need some community scientists out there scouring to find some more, right?
Absolutely.
So Victoria would like to know, what is the advantage of being solitary over being social? Why are
this is a big can of worms. And it's really an interesting question. Lots of papers have been written about it. There are in fact some bee species that are facultatively social. So in some environments they're social, in other environments they're solitary. So if we can save this question towards the end, I can try to revisit it.
Absolutely.
But it might be beyond my pay grade because I'm not an evolutionary biologist.
Got it.
I can regurgitate what I read though.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so James, do you have a few extra minutes to stay a little long so we can?
You know, I can stay as long as you want me to stay. I've done all my house chores for the day, so I'm happy to go overtime if needed.
Okay, so let's save the rest of the questions for the end. And for those of you who had burning questions you want answered, we'll go long with James for the Q&A. All right, James, go for it. You're on again.
Okay. So now I wish I could tell you that you can go and enjoy, great diversity and abundance of bees anywhere you go in San Diego, but unfortunately that simply wouldn't be true because much of San Diego's beautiful natural habitat, especially near the coast where plants are short and easy to bulldoze over, it's been converted to human development. In fact, if you recall this vegetation map in San Diego I showed you earlier, one of the most predominant kinds of land cover is urban development, here depicted in gray. So the loss of this natural habitat is the primary driver of biodiversity loss worldwide, and it's the same in San Diego, and it's the same for bee biodiversity. So a big part of my PhD looked at what happens to bees when you cut up their habitat into smaller pieces. So when we compare bee communities collected from similarly sized study plots in large unfragmented natural reserves, in small small scrub fragments in urban areas, and the urban landscape itself, we found that reserves, a plot the same size will have about 75 bee species. In fragments, that plot would have 50 bee species, and in urban areas, there will be 10 species or less. So this demonstrates that simply preserving habitat is not enough. What we really need to be doing is preserving large unfragmented habitat that's relatively pristine and free from influence from the urban matrix, the urban kind of landscape around it. But also any habitat conserved is still better than no habitat conserved, right? Because you can still get about 50 bee species if you take care of a good high quality scrub fragment. So we should continue to very carefully steward the patchwork of the fragments that we still have left that exists throughout much of San Diego County. Another big threat to biodiversity worldwide is climate change. So we've all heard about global warming, but that's just one aspect of climate change. We also have an increased frequency of extreme climate events and climate fluctuations. Here in San Diego, one of the most harmful examples of this aspect, of course, is drought, which all of you have lived through several of in the recent decade or so. So in our recent study that was just published a couple months ago, we found that bees are somewhat resilient to the drought, even though, as you can imagine, during the drought, when lots of plants die and the annual plants don't bloom, bees are suffering as well. Bees do bounce back after the drought, but still you can see that there's kind of a 30% decrease in bee diversity in the years immediately following the drought. So that's not nothing, right? The bees are not all gone, but there are fewer species that we could find, at least in the couple of years following the drought. But we still don't know exactly what happens to bees during the drought. I think this is a difficult issue to study because most of us who study bees, we look at bees or look for bees on flowers. And when there's no flowers, there isn't really a good standardized approach to being able to know who's flying out there, other than using traps, which in drought years could end up collecting way too many bees and really actually having a large impact on the population, especially in a circumscribed urban environment. We also don't know what happens to bee communities long after the drought, or how long it takes after a drought for the bee community to start to come back and for the species to kind of redistribute themselves across the landscape from surviving pockets of bees. So there's still a lot of room for study, but I think the data that we do have tells us that climate change is a threat that could be at least just as serious as the loss of habitat. So we really need to be keeping an eye on this stressor that's kind of, to a lot of people, much farther back in its kind of consequences than the immediate loss of habitats. What we're showing here is that there could very well be pretty immediate consequences. And the scarier thing about climate change is that it's getting worse all the time. Another threat is, believe it or not, honeybees. So I promised I was going to talk about this earlier. Honeybees have been running wild in California since about the mid-1800s, and in the recent decades, their populations have further expanded because Africanized honeybees have creeped up from Central America, and these are even better adapted to our dry climate. Honeybees are prodigious eaters. There's a recent study that showed that a single honeybee colony could consume the same amount of food as 30,000 solitary bees every month. So that's one honeybee colony to 30,000 solitary bees every month. And in San Diego, there are plants blooming 12 months across the year. So you can imagine how large of an impact honeybees would have. My own research also shows that here in San Diego, honeybees are taking the lion's share of the food that's available to the pollinators. So on this figure here, the light orange portion of each column or bar is honeybees. The dark green is native pollinators, including native bees. On the left-hand side are plant species that are rare in the environment. So something like a lone shooting star plant growing on a hillside. On the right-hand side are plant species that are dominant in the landscape. So maybe like a big stand of buckwheats that's all blooming at the same time. So in this graph, what this shows is that honeybees are disproportionately abundant on the plant species that are providing the majority of flowers in a given area. And if you express the same data, instead of as percentages as I have here, but as raw numbers instead, this is what you get. So this gives you an idea of just how staggeringly abundant honeybees are and how much food resource, pollen and nectar they are removing in the environment and churning out into more honeybees instead of letting those resources become native pollinators that have belonged in our ecosystem, basically for millennia. So what effect this has on the pollinators and on the plants that need to be pollinated is still a question that desperately needs more data. And there are now UCSD researchers that have continued to tackle this problem. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they find. So why should we care about the plight that our native pollinators are facing, especially if honeybees as generalist pollinators are so common in San Diego and can service so many plant species? Well, there are definitely plants out there that honeybees cannot or will not pollinate, like this lupin that has a trip mechanism that's too heavy for honeybees to properly operate. So it needs large beefy bees like this bumblebee to pollinate. There are also plants, for example, in the nightshade family that need buzz pollination. So a bee would have to land in the flower and basically zap it with a sonic blast to shake the pollen loose from the pollen structures. And honeybees cannot do this. So you would have to have a mining bee or a bumblebee or a digger bee to do this, to pollinate nightshades and their relatives. There are also plants like Cryptantha. This is the plant I showed you earlier, where the floral opening is very, very tiny. You need a bee with a specialized structure to reach into these tiny openings to take out the pollen in order for the flower to be pollinated. And then there are also plants like this desert Crumeria that produces oil instead of nectar. So only a specialized lineage of bees that seek oil will be frequently visiting this plant and pollinating them. And even if you're not one of these more specialized plants that rely on kind of a specialized pollination mechanism, you could still benefit from having high bee diversity. So for example, different generalized bee species could have preferences for different plant species. And even if a plant species is serviced by multiple pollinators, they could prefer foraging in different kinds of environmental conditions, or they could be active at different times of the year. And even if they are active at the same time of the year, they could pollinate flowers on different parts of the plant or even different parts of the same flower. And these aren't just theoretical illustrations drawn by Booth, Jen, and Klein. If you're a fruit grower, you can actually look into your berry field and see if you have not enough pollinator diversity in your orchard or in your farm. You can see misshapen fruits as a result of pollination deficiencies. So these problems are very real. In natural ecosystems, if you lose bee diversity or pollinator diversity in general, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to start losing plant diversity as well. And ultimately, in the worst case scenario, you probably end up with most of your plants being replaced by wind pollinated grasses or clonally reproducing plants like this fennel here. So hopefully I've convinced you that you really should care about and learn about our native bees. So now you may be wondering, if you're not a scientist or a land manager or a funding agency, what you can do to help the bees. But there's actually a few things that just about anyone can do that can be very helpful in our effort to conserve native bees. So one excellent way is to go out and just photograph bees and upload them to the community science platform called iNaturalist, which can help biologists keep track of bee populations in a way that we never could have before. So as you can imagine, in any given region, there's only a handful of trained biologists that know how to monitor bees, and they can only be at one place and at one time, and they have to pin the specimens that they collect, and they have other duties to attend to. So they can't be constantly doing this work. But if community members, each armed with a cell phone or a camera, can just go out and photograph bees as they encounter them, then these records really can help us to fill in the gaps and give us very valuable data about what bee groups or what bee species are flying at what places, at what times of the year. These records are actually especially valuable in helping us to monitor bee populations in urban areas. So for the third time today, I'm going to show you this map, just to remind you of where the urban spaces are in San Diego County. And I'm going to show you a heat map of records from iNaturalist here on the left and museum specimens that have thus far been digitized on the right. So you can see that iNaturalist records have of really, really great coverage, especially in the urban areas, which makes sense, right? Like people hang out in their backyards, in their local parks, they see bees, they upload them. Now, we scientists, we can get permits to sample natural areas. So that's why, you see the museum specimen records mostly representing these large, wide open spaces, but we can't get permits to just go down the street and climb everyone's fence and go to all your backyards to see what bees are there. But you can just go out there with a camera. So, just members of the community uploading data from their neighborhoods will really be a huge help to us in understanding what bees are still persisting in urban areas and what we can do better to preserve these urban bees. And also compared to museum records, INAT community members are submitting more and more records every year. So even though there's not a historical database for iNaturalists, 2020 will be historical records for some people at some point in time, right? Time only goes forward. So the growth potential of iNaturalists is enormous. And also iNaturalists community members are sampling bees, or rather uploading bee records in a much more evenly distributed fashion across the months of the year compared to specimens in museum records. So, as a bee biologist, I am guilty of only sampling bees during the peak seasons of bee activity, because otherwise, I need to write papers and TA my courses at some point in time. So I can't be out there all the time. But again, community members can be out there, and you're really helping us to understand what goes on in those months when there isn't huge diversity of floral blooms. So actually, we have a project that's dedicated specifically to the bees of San Diego County, which I co-administrate with the project's founder, Patricia Simpson, who, of course, is on the leaderboard for most observations submitted to this project so far. This project so far has captured 20% of the known bee species diversity in our county, which is amazing, I think. 1 out of every 5 species that occur in our county has already been documented for iNaturalists. So I know this is a shameless plug, but I really hope to convince you to contribute to this project. Another shameless plug I want to bring your attention to is that our very own Cabrillo National Monument has a pollinator palooza coming up. This one is extra cool for me because I'm currently working with scientists and naturalists at Cabrillo and the Southern California Learning Center and UC San Diego and community ecologists around the area to develop some baseline surveys for bees at the park to make even better use of all the iNaturalist records that are coming in from Cabrillo. So I hope you'll also participate in that if you live in the area. I also want to mention that for bees, more than for pretty much any other diverse insect group, there's a really good chance that any record you upload will get quickly identified to the extent possible by one of the most competent and respected taxonomic experts in the world. This is not a shameless plug because it's not me. It's my good friend and mentor, Dr. John Asher, who is a total iNaturalist fanatic. As you can see, he's identified the majority of bee records ever to have been uploaded to North America, and actually in the entire world. And every day he's identifying both new records and a backlog of older records. So Dr. Asher and I are actually in the process of trying to figure out how to best wrangle this treasure trove of data on iNaturalist for formal scientific inquiry alongside a few of our other colleagues. So rest assured, basically, that any effort you take into photographing bees and uploading them to iNaturalist, your records will get properly identified and the data will be put to good use. Another thing you can do is landscape with native plants. So as you know, urbanization is almost irreversible. We're not going to go back from a suburban subdivision back into a natural landscape. So we really need to make the best of what landscape we can muster and modify. So even if it's just yards or roadside plants, if you grow native plants that have co-evolved with the pollinators in this region, you have the opportunity to support not only very generalized pollinators like flies and wasps and, of course, our invasive honeybee, but also potentially the very specialized bees that only forage on those plant species that you could be installing in your yard. As a case study, actually, the Bay Area actually has a lot of bee diversity, even in their urban gardens, which is really a testament to what you can do if you're landscaping with a lot of native plants. We here in San Diego have a lot of catching up to do. I think in our defense, we get a lot less rain than the Bay Area, so it's a lot harder to make your garden look good by growing native plants, which in our area are basically brown and gray twigs for 9 to 11 months of the year. But I think we really can get more creative with our landscaping to incorporate more native plants into our urban spaces. And next, be informed about what Save the Bees means. As you may now guess after hearing this presentation, most of the time when people say save the bees, they really mean save our managed honeybees that are being kept by beekeepers. Now, I am not an anti-honeybee person. I actually have a lot of respect for the species and I like working with them, and there's proof of that here. But honeybees have not only taken just the lion's share of food resources that are available in the San Diego landscape, but they've also captured the public's attention and funding efforts and political clout, despite being literally the least endangered species in the entire world. So we should aim to support not just honeybees managed by beekeepers. It's a real issue and it deserves attention, but we should also be focusing on conservation efforts that target native pollinators as well. So next time if your friend asks you to help save the bees, you can ask them which bees, and then teach them all about native bees. Arm yourself with knowledge. And lastly, support your local natural reserves and parks like Enza Borrego and Torrey Pines and Cuyamaca Rancho, and of course, our beloved Cabrillo. These are wonderful, magical places. And some famous poet, I think once said, we'll only protect what we love and we'll only love what we know. So please do spread the word about the importance of conservation to your friends and family. Take them out on walks to these parks, show them how beautiful nature is, and especially, of course, our bees. And hopefully through all these efforts, our grandchildren's grandchildren will have more bees to enjoy than you and I get to have today. And with that, I'd like to thank all the people and agencies that have made my work possible. And I would like to thank you for being here today. At this time, I would love to take any additional questions, and my contact information is below. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions in the future.
All right. Thank you so much for that, James. That was fantastic. I'm going to share my screen really fast here just to re-emphasize. Thank you for mentioning Pollinator Palooza. It is, in fact, Pollinator Palooza. Well, what is that? Well, this public talk is one of them. It's a celebration of all things plant and pollinator for the next 6 months. And so our previous talk from last month was Dr. Kristen Lear, and she talked about bats and agaves, and that is actually up on our website if you'd like to watch a recording of that. And there's going to be more live talks like the one you contributed to tonight to come. And as James mentioned, we've got a Pollinator Palooza project in iNaturalist right now. So you can come to Cabrillo National Monument, take your pictures of your flowering plants and your native bees or other pollinators and upload them to our project and help us with the scientific endeavors we're doing there. And brand new, there's a plein air event. So for the next month, there's going to be 10 or so community artists painting the beautiful flowers and plants of Cabrillo National Monument. So head on down to the park and look for them and see some works of art in action. Let me stop my share. And there are so many great questions tonight. We've got 31 questions queued up. So I don't know
I'm happy to be here for all of it.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do all of them. But let's get started on those questions, all right? So first of all, Ashley would like to know, do you have a favorite bee species? Very important question.
Yeah, my current favorite is Cimolobus ipomoea, but that's kind of only because as far as I know, I'm the only person to have been able to photograph it live. So it's got a special place in my heart because it's a very rare bee species that only forages from the wild morning glory plants in Midwestern and Eastern US, and it only flies very early in the morning. So basically, you have to get up super early in the morning, go find this rare plant, and then camp next to it and try to photograph this thing in very poor lighting. So I was able to get a couple of decent pictures. So it's my favorite bee right now.
That's awesome. I know it probably rotates, right? It's hard to choose.
Mm-hmm.
So someone would like to know, do bees migrate when the seasonal plants available change?
Bees don't, for the most part, because bees have a nest. They form a nest and they're basically going to stay within, for a small species, within a few meters of that nest. For large and especially social species, they can fly a couple kilometers away from the nest, I think up to 5 kilometers. But they do always have to come back to that nest. On the other hand, last year I read this super fascinating article that shows that in Europe, there are these mass bumblebee migrations of young queens that presumably are about to just form their first colonies. So the idea is that maybe at the end of a generation, a bunch of new bumblebee queens will make this huge migration to safer wintering grounds. And then when the conditions are right, they make this huge migration back, sometimes across the sea, like over the sea to the British Isles or something, to better nesting grounds to form a colony. And then at the end of the season, their new queens again migrate back to wintering grounds. There's only one study on that so far, and they haven't really definitively shown that this is really what's going on. But they do have basically observations of a sustained stream of individual bumblebee queens all flying in the same direction.
Amazing. So, and I'm sure there's active research being done right now to actually.
There is.
Yeah, that's good. How do our native solitary bees survive fire in chaparral and coastal sage scrub?
That's a great question. So, unfortunately, anything that's above ground and flying around will get consumed by the fire. But ground nesting bees, whose nests are underground, if the fire occurs and they're underground, they can be safe because the fire really doesn't. The high temperatures really don't reach that far below. Now, what happens after the fire likely is that those bees whose nests are in the epicenter of the fire, they won't be able to find anything to eat, and they'll have to fly outside the fire zone and make new nests. But what's a cool finding is that fires recycle the nutrients and opens up the canopy, and usually the year or even years following the fire, the native flowering plants, especially the herbaceous species, come back in full force. And you get a huge bonanza of resources for bees, and bee diversity can actually really boom in the places that had fires.
So as long as
fire is very important.
Yeah, so as long as they can survive that initial fire, then
That's
there's
right.
Abundance, so well for them later on. That's awesome.
That's right.
So Cindy would like to know, because you were speaking about buzz pollinators. Does that mean the Western honeybee cannot pollinate tomatoes since they're in the nightshade family?
That's right. That's right. They cannot, and that's why commercial growers who grow tomatoes that cannot self-pollinate, they use bumblebees for that. And actually, and a bad news story is that people use commercial bumblebee colonies from the east, so the common eastern bumblebee. And one of my collaborators has found that in the fields near one of his tomato growers' greenhouses, he's finding escaped populations of an eastern bumblebee that really doesn't belong in California. So bad things can happen. But yeah, tomato growers do use bumblebee colonies to pollinate instead of honeybees.
I had no idea. That's awesome. John says he lives in a chaparral-dominated area, and I've seen a lot of native bees here. If I get rid of my domestic beehives, am I likely to see an increase in native bee abundance and diversity?
I would say it seems likely. If you only have one honeybee colony, it may not make that much of a difference. My approach, my philosophy now is that if you only have one beehive, the beehive is a drop in the bucket because feral honeybees are just so abundant. So, I used to have friends who say, "Oh, should I get a beehive?" I'm like, "No, this is a horrible thing to do for the environment." But if having a beehive puts you closer to nature and it gives you the opportunity to talk about pollinators and conservation and pollination mutualisms and the chance to talk about native pollinators as well, then the honeybee can be a gateway bee. Right. So if you just have one beehive, chances are you could potentially see some differences, but the differences won't be large because the concentration of feral, like wild running honeybees is just so high already.
That makes sense. In another presentation, it was said that in China, because of pollinator losses, humans must do the pollinating. Is that true?
I heard conflicting stories about that. So there's a famous picture of people hand pollinating, I think pear or peach or some sort of rosaceous fruit. And apparently the story is like they're hand pollinating not because they don't have any bees there, but because manual labor is cheaper in that part of the world than hiring a beekeeper to bring their bees, or to rely on local management strategies to boost native pollinator populations. But I can imagine a future in which we've so wrecked the environment that to have sustainable and guaranteed returns on your insect pollinator crops, you do have to hand pollinate. But studies really have shown that, like, if you're an orchardist and you take even just the minimal steps to manage your orchard for native pollinators, like, leave them places to nest, don't overdo it on the pesticides, leave some wildflowers around, then most orchards should be able to support enough bees that you won't need to go to a hand pollination regime.
So just let nature do its work, in other words.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you have any tips for taking good bee photos to share on iNaturalist?
Oh my gosh, I wish I did. My philosophy right now is that the best photos you have are the photos where you happen to be there and you happen to have some sort of camera on you. So most of the images I've shown today are images like either from my phone camera or just like a cheap pocket point and shoot that could be survive in my field backpack with all the gear. I think recently what I've learned is that if you want a good photo of a bee, the thing to do isn't to like walk around trying to chase a bee, but to identify a flower or a patch of flowers that's particularly rewarding, and then just train your camera on a particular area, have it in focus, and then wait for the bee to come to the flower. So I haven't been able to do that because I always have to collect data. But if I were to be going out and doing just photography, that's what I would do. I would train my camera on a particular place and wait for the bee to come to me. So for you biologists out there, I'd be an ambush predator instead of an active hunter.
I love it. And we do actually happen to have iNaturalist power user Patricia Simpson, who you mentioned earlier. She's actually in the chat right now saying, be patient. Nice dad joke, Patricia. But really, she's amazing at catching photographs of these bees. So Patricia, if you have any advice, feel free, besides be patient, feel free to type it into the chat right now as well.
With respect to iNaturalist in particular, I would say also take photos from different angles. And even if the photo is a little bit blurry, you can upload it. Like just earlier today, I messaged one of my my naturalist friends who uploaded a photo of this rare specialist short-faced bee that only forages on Phacelia. And I was like, well, this looks like it should be Conanthalictis bakeri, but I want to see the wing veins. So then he uploaded an additional photo that has the wing vein. I mean, the bee is more out of focus and, it's not great, but the wing veins are good enough for me to say that's 3 submarginal cells, that's Conanthalictis and not Duforia. So if you have bee photos from multiple angles, it really will help us be biologists to upload all the angles you have, even if the photos are a little bit blurry.
Awesome, thank you. And Patricia, I see you're actually typing your response just to the panelists. If you could change your response to panelists and attendees, that would be helpful. Okay, Molly would like to know, could native gardens that are minimally irrigated in suburban areas help see native bees through droughts? And she's thinking of the vision of folks like Doug Tallamy to make yards into connected parks. Any thoughts on that?
Our study that I showed a little bit of drought data from really does suggest that bees that are living in more urban areas, they could potentially be benefiting from irrigated urban food resources. So I think there really is very real possibility that any form of irrigation that helps the bees to have something to eat through these droughts could potentially help. And if we combine that with actually growing native plants, then we could see not just the very generalized, I guess, like what a lot of bee biologists will call weedy bee species, the urban adapters that like to forage on weeds, for example. If we have good quality native plants that are grown, especially near good natural habitat, like those really can potentially have highly leveraged conservation potential. And of course, more study is needed on that, but I wouldn't be surprised if you find that in a drought year, if you have, a patch of irrigated buckwheat or black sage or something, it'll get filled with bees because that'll be the only gig in town.
Ashley is commenting that recently there's been reports about cherry blossom trees blooming earlier in the year than before, like in Washington, D.C. and in Japan. And so how will the change in bloom times, these blooming plants, affect bees?
Good question. And this is when people study climate change and its impact on bees. This is the most often invoked topic, which is a mismatch between the timings of the bees and the plants. Because even though bees and their plants historically before climate change have been able to be pretty in sync with one another, they could be queuing into actually different things that used to all line up together. But if the things that they're queuing in are becoming decoupled due to climate change, we do get scenarios where things are blooming and not being pollinated. And we also get scenarios where bees are out and either they've totally missed their the blooming of their host plant, or they're out too early and their host plant is not blooming yet. So yes, this is a big problem, and some of the best and brightest people are studying this. And it's actually one of the topics that I'm going to try to study as well when I found my lab in a few months.
So when you're ready, I hope you come back and give another talk about this.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so.
Ellie would like to know, why does different flower colors matter to bees? Like, why do they have that diversity of color? Does that help?
Yeah, so in pollination, so bees in general seem to be not very good at seeing red. So red just looks kind of like a gray black to them. They're very sensitive to blues and yellows, and ultraviolet. So plants that are adapted to pollination by birds, for example, they often have red coloration because it's inconspicuous to bees, but it pops for birds. Whereas for these blue and yellow and white flowers, like bees can see them very well. Now, whether it should be blue or yellow, I think that's a good question. I think a lot of the times, there's the lineage to be considered, right? So there are very few blue, like sunflowers, for example. Like very few sunflowers have like bright blue petals, and things like the phacelias. I forgot what their common name is. Scorpion weed, I think. Like most of them have like a purplish, pinkish hue. I don't know of any yellow phacelias, for example. So some of it depends on the lineage of the plant. I wouldn't be surprised if selection by pollinators have a lot to do with it. But this isn't my field of expertise, so I'm gonna not overstep what I know.
All right, sounds good. Christina would like to know, and we're just going to do 2 more questions. There's still a bunch more, but we've gone over quite a bit here, and we've taken.
Yeah, sorry to be.
Oh, no worries, James. It was I could talk to you all night long, like I said earlier.
Well, thank you. For those who didn't get to ask your questions, do you mind if I put my slide back? Oh, actually, my slide is back up here. Is it not? Actually, no.
Share your screen again.
I'll share it again. My email is here. So if you have other burning questions, I very much welcome you to just send me an email and I'll do my best to answer.
Perfect. Thank you, James. So we're going to do 2 more questions. Christina would like to know, why did you choose pumpkin/squash pollination for your research?
That's a great question. It so happens that a researcher whom I really respected and liked a lot, her name is Karen Goodell. She got a grant to work on this. And I'm just like, oh, I get the chance to work with my friend Karen. So I postdoced in her lab and worked on this. And this was an attractive project to me as well, because my PhD was all about conserving bees in natural habitat, which is great. And hopefully I've convinced you today that this is something important to do. But I also thought getting into an economically important crop and getting exposure to the farmer's perspective and the different challenges that are involved in having to manage a field, not just to protect bees and your pollinators, but also having to control things like cucumber beetles that could decimate your crop unless you do something about it. These are unique challenges that I think farmers face, that conservation biologists working in natural ecosystems don't face to the same extent. So I welcome the opportunity to round out my skill set.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, this
Plus,
is,
pumpkins are delicious.
yeah. And conservation isn't a closed system, right? I mean, humans are on this
Very
planet
true.
as well, and we have our needs that need to be met as well. So
Yeah, very true. You use it or you lose it, right? So the best thing to do is to figure out how to not lose it while also using it, if that makes sense.
it absolutely does. So Ashley would like to know, what is something you've learned about bees that really surprised you?
I think that the thing I shared today about bees being brewers that eat a lot of microbes that gets basically cultivated in the pollen nectar provision that they make, that blew my mind when I found out about that last year. So that's kind of the recent like big surprise thing that I learned in the bee literature.
Yeah, that is incredible. Me too.
Yeah.
I didn't know that until tonight.
Mhm.
So thank you
It's
for
quite new news for sure.
Now we're going to end tonight's talk with one last question, and this is a selfish question because I happen to know part of the answer, but I want to hear from you. Um, in a BioBlitz that we did this last September, one of our community scientists found a very interesting bee. I don't know if you can speak to this at all. I know there's some research being done on this bee at the park. Is this something that you can talk about at all tonight, or do we need to?
I see. I can't give too many details, but basically, uh, one of our community scientists discovered a bee that shouldn't be there um, via photography, and this naturalist sent me the photo and was like, "What is this thing?" I was like, "Oh my goodness, this looks like a thing that shouldn't be here." So I sent the photo to my to my taxonomist friends, and they're like, "Yep, this thing shouldn't be here." So we're working on writing up a paper with this community scientist friend as a co-author, basically to say, hey, we're the first ones to find this bee that isn't supposed to be here. And if it weren't for the fact that there's an active community science community here doing the photography, we would never have known about this. And actually, more generally from this phenomenon, and I can talk about this, is that actually a lot of first points of invasion, whether it be from Asia or Europe or other parts of the world into North America, and vice versa as well. A lot of first points of invasion weren't detected by biologists doing formal surveys. It's from people taking a photo of like, oh, I've never seen this before, and they post it on iNaturalist or on Bug Guide. And then my friend John Asher was like, this thing is from Europe. It's not supposed to be in Pasadena. And then, often he'll say like, this is the first record. And, we don't always write these things up, but I think for this Cabrillo case, we are writing it up because it is really very cool. And we do want to bring attention to the fact that community science can be doing wonders for monitoring bees going forward.
Exactly. And that's why I wanted to end on this question, is just to drive the point home, folks, that you can actually contribute to real science and make incredible discoveries by doing these projects with iNaturalist, for instance. So I hope that learning about this helps encourage you to go ahead and do that. Well, folks, I just want to thank you so much for coming tonight. I want to thank our sponsor, Cabrillo National Monument Foundation. If you are interested in attending Cabrillo for the Stars, it's a free event. If you enjoyed tonight's talk to the foundation, you can see the information on my screen right there. Go to cnmf.org to find out more. And thank you again, Dr. James Hung, for dropping all of that knowledge on us tonight. And this is where we're going to end tonight's talk. Thank you,
Thanks
everyone.
again for having me.
Thank you. Have a great night, everyone.